Look, we all know which genre took the win this year. Yeah! And today we are ranking the death metal albums of 2023, starting with Mithridatum and Harrowing. This band features former members of Abhorrent and the Faceless, and it is a dissonant, blackened death metal trio that should be a welcome addition to listeners who enjoy the likes of Krallis, Gorguts, and Deathspell Omega, too, for that matter. And despite the dizzying maelstrom of sound, Harrowing never feels like style over substance. This is a really quality album that really keeps a consistent engagement. It's very carefully orchestrated, in fact. Just the malevolence and this chaos still comes together despite the chaotic drumming and atonal guitars. It never really derails into feeling pretentious or off-putting, and so for that reason, it made perfection. By the way, obviously this is not an exhaustive list. It's not even every death metal album I've listened to and talked about this year, but for the sake of the length of the video, I just scaled it down to 35 albums, and it's really just an excuse to showcase as many killer albums as possible. Even the lower level stuff here is worth checking out, but for the sake of not being here all day, let's continue with Cadaver and The Age of the Offended. This is a Norwegian band with roots going all the way back to the late 80s with an interestingly spaced out discography with 2 albums released in the early 90s, 2 more in the 2000s, and then this now the second of the 2020s. Add drummer Dirk Verburen of Megadeth and Soilwork fame, and fittingly their sound is quite a mixture of old and new. Riffs are frequently infused with elements of thrash, groove, and kind of carcassy death and roll. I will say that despite agreeing that things are becoming overly sanitized, the incredibly on-the-nose album title is kind of cringe, and as a whole, this one just didn't really stick with me, so it landed at meh. Next up, we're going to do Dying Fetus with Make Them Beg for Death. So lead single Feast of Ashes delivered those lightning fast leads that we know and love and got me pretty hyped for this thing. I also love the pure concentrated rage and thrashier riffs of Throw Them in the Van, which clocks in at under 2 minutes, which is always a fun time. It's not my favorite Dying Fetus album. You can check out the tier list I just did to figure out which one was, but I do think that this has some of the band's most dynamic songwriting to date to really keep you on your toes. Really good one. Not even one of my favorites of all the legacy acts this year. We will get to all of those, but it is going pretty high at great tier. Next up is ULTHAR with Anthronomicon and Helionomicon. More chaotic, technically infused death metal with 2 new albums from these underground darlings who I've been enjoying for a while now. Anthronomicon in particular gave me exactly what I wanted, especially given my past love for Cosmovore and Providence. Really strong, kind of earlier album this year. Plenty of ups and downs and sudden changes to keep you from ever getting bored or even like maintaining a stable footing, I would say. So this one landed at fantastic for me. And then we have the boys Sanguisugabogg with Homicidal Ecstasy. Now, as I've said before, it seems like everyone loves this band but me, but I will call this a significant improvement from the last one. I actually enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would. It grew on me quite a bit, lots of infectious grooves and swampy atmosphere that really seeps into your pores. I just get a little bored with the lack of any vocal variety, and the songwriting could still be a little bit more original and memorable. So, still going pretty low at okay tier, but, you know, I enjoyed it nonetheless.
It's perfectly fine.
Next up, we have Gorod with The Orb. So I've been in love with this band since a maze of recycled creeds, and with bangers like Savitri, We Are the Sun Gods, and The Orb, I am once more very satisfied. It's a little dubious calling this a straight death metal album because I feel like it goes more kind of overtly prog, some kind of like Gojira elements that come through in this band too, but great technicality. Love the songwriting. The guitar work just gives me arthritis thinking about it and listening to it, and then the bass and drumming are fantastic as well. So this one is also going to fantastic. By the way, as always, if you're enjoying the video, hit the like button and comment your own agreements, disagreements, and additional albums below. But next up, we have Autopsy with Ashes, Organs, Blood, and Crypts. So another legacy old school death metal band in a year full of them, and frankly the one that's kind of one of my least favorites generally, but I gotta say I think that this is easily one of Autopsy's best albums. It's this D-beat infused death metal that really does sound like a pack of infected feral creatures biting at your heels, mixed in with some like 70s psychedelic nightmare bad trip vibes. And they also really pull out a lot of earworms, which I think is what really kept me invested. Lots of just really creepy melodies that slither into your lower brain. Great pacing too to keep things interesting. Even the doomier sections I enjoyed. So this one is going to good tier. Then we have Phlebotomized with Clouds of Confusion. My favorite element of this album is definitely the synths. They give everything this kind of misty, otherworldly atmosphere, but unfortunately, everything else is just sort of not so great to me. The riffs are fine, frequently taking a more doomy and melodic approach, but also picking up at times for songs like Destined to be Killed. But then there are the harsh vocals that are just so incredibly one note that it takes away from what otherwise feels like a more dynamic experience. And the clean vocals are honestly, frankly, just pretty bad in my opinion. So this one landed at meh. Next up is Fabricant with Drudge to the Thicket. This California trio also does that whole dissonant avant-garde death metal sound, clearly inspired by the likes of Gorguts and again Krallis. Drudge to the Thicket is a just noisy, violent lament configuration of a record, as I put it in my Best of the Month video, and it's complex yet strangely infectious again, thanks to ever-driving rhythms and standout moments, with that incredible bass solo too on Song of Stillness. So yeah, this one is landing at great tier, and funny that this and Phlebotomized had almost the same album cover. Next up we have Alkaloid with Numen. So in case you've been living in a cave, this features members of Triptychon, Obscura, Dark Fortress, Obsidious, and way more. It's this fantastic supergroup, one of my favorite supergroups of the modern era, especially in death metal. It's another band that it's a little dubious calling it just straight death metal because there are plenty of stretches of kind of more clean vocals, more just that prog energy, but it really comes together in a way that is just so impressive on tracks like Cliffosis and the Cambrian Explosion, just really kicking things off and on a strong note, very mind-bending but heavy at the same time. And then you've got the infectious stomp of Clusterfuck and the fungi of Yoggoth, constantly shifting rhythms on shades of Shubha Niggurath, and more classic prog influences on the title track, Perfection. Love this album, one of my favorites of the year. Next up is Contrarian with Sage of Shekhinah. This is a New York band, clearly influenced by classic acts like Death, Cynic, and Atheist, and how they approach the songwriting, and at times, right down to the production, tracks like Gehenna sound as if they could have come right off of symbolic or individual thought patterns. It can definitely get a little bit chaotic, and not maybe in as good a way as some of the others I've mentioned here for, but the musicians are clearly lovers of the genre, and I think that people who love that kind of like later career death sounding stuff are just going to gobble this up. So I'm going to put this one at, where did I have it? I think I had it at great tier. Next up is Celestial Sanctuary with Insatiable Thirst for Torment. Another relatively modern band doing the new wave of old school death metal sound. These guys formed in the UK in 2019. I saw a lot of hype for this one at the end of August, despite it initially kind of slipping under my radar. But when I hear enough people in the audience talking about something, I tend to give it a spin at least. In the past, that has sometimes led to some of my favorite albums, but in this case, I just thought it was decent. I think the instrumentation doesn't strike me as anything particularly memorable or noteworthy, and the vocals aren't really doing it for me. Really great atmosphere though, so I'm going to put this at okay. tier. Next up is Nightmare with Deformity Adrift. I instantly fell in love with 2018's Cacophony of Terror, and this follow-up continues with that same ferocious flurry of chaotic guitars and drumming. Think of it as kind of a cross between the groove-ridden infectiousness of Meshuggah with the more strange and dissonant elements of bands like Artificial Brain. And really, that's a difficult balance to maintain, so hats off again for bringing complex and challenging performances in a package that is still relatively palatable for people making that transition from the more kind of broad and traditional death metal. I'm going to put this one at great tier as well. And actually, you know what? I had Contrarian at good tier after all. But next up is Tomb Mold with the Enduring Spirit. It seems like that 4 years away really built up this Toronto crew's creative juices, because that bass solo and sudden pace change on Angelic Fabrications alone really reminded me why these guys are one of the better OSDM bands in the game in the modern era, and then that melodic section in Will of Whispers, and the reasons even become more obvious the deeper you get into this thing. I don't think it's quite on par with some of my proggy picks on here, but it's definitely a standout. It's definitely high up, and so it jumped right up to fantastic. Then we have Wormhole with Almost Human. I've never been in love with this band's more brutal sound, again with the vocals being the biggest point of detraction, but I do love the more, again, Gorgutsy songwriting here. The compositions feel much more complex and at times noisy and bordering on the avant-garde, others still knowing when to just chug it up or explode into a more melodic solo. I think if they toyed a little bit more with diversity in the vocal delivery, I'd like this a lot more, but I think it works for what it's going for overall, and it makes me intrigued to see where they'll evolve from here. So ultimately, this one is going to pretty high up on OK tier. Then there's Incantation with Unholy Deification. Another dose of brutality in their usual two-speed approach of unrelenting blast beat-driven death metal and plodding, miserable doom. There are some stronger points here and there, but ultimately, hearing this back-to-back with new albums from nearly all of their 90s peers this year only furthered my impression that these guys are just near the bottom of the pack continuously for me. They continue to be one of my least favorites of the old guard from the 90s, so yeah, this one landed at meh for me, even if it's still one of their stronger albums, I would say. Then there's the Zenith Passage with Daedalicium. Another supergroup here featuring former members of the Faceless and other incredibly talented bands. This is another dizzying display of arthritis-inducing proficiency that goes hand in hand with the likes of Archspire, Alkaloid, and Surreption, Algorithmic Salvation, and Lexicontagion. Great titles too, by the way. But they're just enough alone to snap my head right off my neck with the contortions that they put me through. And I think, again, it's important to point out that it's not just woodly-woo music. I think that the technical aspects are in favor of strong songwriting as opposed to it being just in favor of the woodly-woo. So yeah, this one is going to fantastic. Then we have Obituary with Dying of Everything. Lots of simple guitar here, but very infectious hooks, and they still just seem to understand the assignment. The solos are also very tastefully done. Despite being a pretty meat and potatoes death metal album, the dynamics still managed to keep it pretty varied and engaging all the way through. Just 10 banger tracks, no duds, solid production, keeping that old school grit while giving it space to breathe. Again, not one of my favorite bands from the 90s, but I think this was a really enjoyable one, a good earlier album this year to kick things off. Just hard to compete on this very, very stacked list. So ultimately, this one landed at good tier to me, right around the same area as Autopsy. Then there is Afterbirth with In But Not Of. Again, so many bands from the 90s dropping albums this year, and from ones I didn't necessarily expect. But unfortunately, this one just didn't quite land for me. The instrumentation is spectacular, but I, again, have just never enjoyed this more gurgly vocal approach, and I just can't get past it when I'm listening to this thing. If I want that progressive songwriting with still more kind of traditional death vocals, I much prefer the Tomb Mold album, as well as a few others on this list. But yeah, this one, it just, I tried because I saw people raving about it, and it's like I wanted to love it, but I just didn't. I don't think it's bad by any means. In fact, it's quite great in a lot of areas, but ultimately it went to okay.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
Then there's Outer Heaven with Infinite Psychic Depths. More OSDM worship, and this one also getting a lot of praise from the audience. Another one that I just had to go check out because everybody was talking about it. I do appreciate the cavernous production job and spooky guitar harmonies. Nice layering of these savage vocals too, but I just found it to be kind of overhyped. Maybe if people hadn't been hyping as much, I might have enjoyed it more. Sometimes that's the case, but I saw some people calling this like the best death metal album of the year, and I just thought it was okay. I thought it was solid. I think it's better than some other modern OSDM out there, but ultimately it was still, I liked it better than like Afterbirth, but it still landed at okay for me.
You were the chosen one!
Another big one here, we have Suffocation with Hymns from the Apocrypha. Now, I actually had low expectations going into this one, but again, Ricky Myers sounds fantastic as the new vocalist, and more importantly, the dynamic songwriting on this album is, I think, some of their best. Perpetual Deception has more great twists and turns. I love the carcassy melodic intro and bass work on Dim Veil of Obscurity, and Seraphim Enslavement just totally blew me away as the lead single. Honestly, again, not a single dud on this album, and once more in a year packed with incredible legacy acts. This really defied my expectations and jumped all the way up to fantastic. Then we got Vomitory with All Heads Are Gonna Roll. They formed all the way back in 1989, and this is the Swedish band's first album back after a long hiatus since like 2011. And it's a deeply aggressive album, very much in the early era of death metal, bringing that bulldozing, thrash-infused riff style over blast beats and D-beats. Another perfect album for those yearning for just that old school sound. I really dig the instrumentation, but frankly, again, I think the vocals are actually kind of annoying and monotonous. And that's a personal taste thing. This is all subjective anyways, that's why I want you to comment below where you disagree, but for me, this one landed at meh. Then we have Seven Doors with Feast of the Repulsive Dead. This is a one-man horror-themed project named for the hotel in Lucio Fulci's The Beyond, with a very Cannibal Corpse sound, and in addition to the chugging riffs and head-bombing pace, I love the explosions of reverb-soaked and spooky cemetery vibe guitars. And of course with track names like The Morbid Mortician, The Hack Shack, and Cannibalistic Humanoid Underground Dwellers, you should already have a pretty good idea of what to expect from this one. I really enjoyed it, and it's not like the greatest things in sliced bread, but I think it fit at good tier. Then we have Pestilence with Beliefs of Dead Stargazers and Soothsayers. This is the debut full-length album from this Australian band, and while the drumming and wailing guitars show some impressive level of speed, the overall songwriting and vocals ultimately drag it down for me. Once more, I just think about the thousands of other bands that have already more or less perfected this approach and how I could be listening to them instead. So, yeah, little maybe jaded, you could call me, but this one ended up at meh for me. But again, those lower tier albums still worth listening to, still enjoyable in their own right. Then there's Cryptopsy with As Gomorrah Burns.
I was promised a utopia.
So So opinions of this band and this album seem to be all over the place, but I loved the Book of Suffering EPs and the self-titled, and I think this is the perfect follow-up to those, opening up on a seriously battering note with Lascivious Undivine, and Flayed the Swine is another one that made an instant impression with that stank face-inducing intro riff transition. Ill Ender is another standout, bringing some stellar moments on both fronts, going hyperspeed in the first half before slowing down and getting swampy in the second. In my opinion, 34 minutes of just sheer perfect death metal, and again, some of their best work. Like, I can't believe how many of these bands from way back in the day are putting out some of their best stuff in my opinion. They made me eat my words because I tend to be the guy who's like, why is everybody still listening to the same 5 bands over and over again when there's all this new stuff? Hey, they made me eat crow this year. This one went to perfection for me. Yes, higher than some of these other legacy acts, and you can fight me on that. Then there's Carnation with Cursed Mortality. This is a Belgian death metal band that's been kicking around since about 2013 and delivering on a bit of that HM2 Swedish sound a la early Entombed, with a bit of blackened atmosphere and corpse paint for good measure. This is their 3rd full-length album, and it's pretty solid stuff overall, if a bit unremarkable. Everything sounds great, the production is solid, love the D-beat infused menace, and Andy LaRocque of King Diamond also makes an appearance, but I doubt I'll remember this a few months from now, and frankly the clean singing sections, even though there aren't that many, are pretty weak, I think. So yeah, this one landed at okay for me. Then there's Nothingness with Supraliminal. This Minneapolis band helped to kick off this amazing year of death metal back in January with more brutal HM2-driven goodness, mixing blackened atmosphere and grindy riffers, solid pacing with some doomier moments to break up the blast beats, but never long enough to lose the momentum, and regardless of whether it's full speed ahead or slower groove, expected to just be heavy as shit. This was a really solid album. I'm going to put this one at great tier. And then staying noisy, we have Alterage with Worst Case Scenario.
Holy Mother of God.
These guys are just absolutely unstoppable in my opinion. I've been listening to them since they dropped their debut full-length Nile in 2016, and now just 7 years later they have 6 full-lengths and every single one of them is top shelf. From the lurching dragging corpse of Enigma Signals to the chaotic pace changes of O-Work, I'm starting to wonder if they've even surpassed Portal in terms of quality at this point, which is something I said in previous videos. I'm going to stand by it. They just keep getting better and better. Check them out. They're going to perfection. Then we have Frozen Soul with Glacial Domination. More really solid OSDM, this band going for a bit more of a bolt thrower vibe in some ways. Lots of banger tracks, and it's fairly typical stuff that I've found to get old pretty fast after a few listens, unfortunately. I really like the leads on Frozen Soul, nice guest appearances too, especially Dying Fetus' John Gallagher on Morbid Effigy. I also like the synth interludes a lot, but they don't really integrate and kind of gel with the rest of the music. I'd be interested to hear those elements more woven into some of the songs. I think that would help them stand out a little bit more. So solid stuff, but again, I just thought it was a little overhyped. Don't really remember much of it in retrospect after I listened to it, so it landed at good tier. Then we have Stillbirth with Homo Deus. I've generally appreciated this German band's output as pretty standard death metal headbanging fodder, but I think that this is some of their strongest material too. Like, the technical elements are great, but there's also clearly a lot of thought going into arrangement. Rising from the Ashes is a great example of them carefully walking that balance between brutality and memorability, not to mention some really standout bass work as well. So this one landed pretty high up on great tier. Another big one here, we have Cattle Decapitation with Terracite. The boys outdoing themselves once again with this one. Fantastic singles with Travis covering the full spectrum of his vocal acrobatics on We Eat Our Young and Scourge the Offspring. I think it's the even better single. Love the super gnarly, phlegmy vocals and riffing on the Insignificance. Aphotic Doom, Dead End Residence, Solastalgia, and The Storm Upstairs bring more serious stank-face groove. And then we close with that epic 10-plus minute Just Another Body. Easily one of my favorite death metal albums of 2023. So good. If you somehow haven't listened to it yet, you really need to. It's going really high up on perfection.
Cattle decapitation. Now there's a little UFO thing going on there, maybe.
I'm assuming there was already a cattle mutilation.
Then we have Creeping Death with Boundless Domain. Another one of the big new wave names of OSDM, crusty D-beats, raging HM2, and some seriously malevolent sounding vocals, bringing the mosh pit straight to your living room or wherever it is that you're listening for some good headbanging. George Corpse Grinder Fisher of Cannibal Corpse also making an appearance on the groovy intestinal rap. And after the death of Riley Gale, they were also inspired to dig into some hardcore with influences from Mammoth Grinder, Iron Age, and of course Power Trip. Solid album again, just pretty typical modern OSDM though, I would say, so enjoyable to listen to, but not one of my favorites. It's also going to good tier, kind of right along like Frozen Soul. We also have A Causal Intrusion with Panpsychism. This duo delivering more cavernous weight behind their songs than most bands 2 to 3 times their size or who have been around as long. Jagged riffs, unpredictable rhythms, and chilling, bellowing death growls echoing into oblivion. And I love how they managed to sprinkle in these spookier earworm hooks again to make the chaos more engaging. Great balance of dissonance and melody again, kind of on the same wavelength as stuff like Portal and Ulcerage. This one landed at fantastic. And then another big daddy here, we have Cannibal Corpse with Chaos Horrific. Summon for Sacrifice definitely got me pretty hyped with its broadened dynamics and more kind of domination era morbid angel sounding vibes. It's sort of like you hear one Cannibal Corpse album, you've almost heard them all, even though there are subtle differences, as I said in my tier list. But yeah, this one actually got me pretty hyped again. And there's also Blind Blood, which is like wading through a literal swamp of mucky gore. It takes a lot to impress me when it comes to new Cannibal Corpse, but I have to hand it to them for stepping up the songwriting and technical elements. I think it's an improvement over the previous two, and really every track here has something a little different to offer. So this one landed at great tier. I think it's like kind of right alongside Dying Fetus. Maybe I liked it a little bit more than that one. Hard to decide. And then we have Horrendous with Ontological Mysterium.
Bring me back, but I'll keep on climbing.
Now, it's always a ballsy move to take such a left turn with your sound, but I think anyone who's been paying attention to this band's development over the years and their clear worship of all eras of death and cynic shouldn't be at all surprised. I could see some old school death metal purists hating that it's less overtly death metal, like this is another album that's more of like a progressive metal album overall. But again, as I said in my Best of the Month video, I think that if Death were still around, they probably would have wound up in a similar place sonically. And I would also recommend this to fans of everything from Atheist to Obscura. I think it's stunning. It's one of the best albums I've heard all year, and it is going to the very top of perfection. Y'all check out this playlist for more death metal rankings, and stay tuned for more 2023 tier lists by genre. I've already done one for thrash metal, and there's plenty more to come. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.